Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. You know how sometimes it feels like we're just swimming in information?
Yeah, totally.
It's like, I'm not always sure what to trust right.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're going to tackle that head on. We're diving into the world of propaganda, censorship, and truth.
Big topics.
Big topics indeed. And we've got some fascinating sources lined up. Everything from historical accounts to modern-day analyses. So we'll trace how propaganda has evolved from, say, Nazi Germany
Oh, wow.
to today's digital age.
Right.
Think about it, even telling a joke about Hitler back then could land you in serious trouble.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The control over information was really that tight.
And it makes you wonder, how much of what we see and hear today is shaped by similar forces.
It's a great question and one we'll definitely explore. It's interesting how propaganda often hinges on this idea that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth.
Right, like people start to believe it just because they've heard it so many times.
Exactly. And the Nazis were masters of this. They understood the power of controlling the narrative.
So how did they actually do it? I mean, how did they spread their message so effectively?
Well, they really went all in. They took over newspapers, radio broadcasts, even the film industry, turning them into mouthpieces for their ideology.
Wow, so it's like complete control over the media.
Pretty much. Imagine you pick up a newspaper or turn on the radio, and all you get is a constant stream of Nazi rhetoric.
It's like brainwashing almost.
It was very much a deliberate attempt to shape people's thoughts and beliefs. And then there were the book burnings.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about those. That's just chilling.
Yeah, on May 10th, 1933, the Nazis held these infamous book burnings.
Publicly destroying any books they considered dangerous.
Exactly. They targeted anything that challenged their ideology or promoted ideas they deemed un-German.
When you think about the sheer volume of knowledge lost in those flames, it's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely. It was a powerful symbol of their desire to control information and suppress any dissenting voices.
So this control of the media was the main way they spread their propaganda.
It was definitely key, especially with radio being a relatively new technology at the time.
Right, because radio allowed them to reach directly into people's homes.
Exactly. It bypassed traditional channels and gave them this direct line to the masses.
I mean, in a way, it's like the early version of social media.
Kind of. Yeah, you could say that.
Speaking of radio, I was surprised to learn how crucial it was for propaganda during World War II. Not just for the Nazis, but for other countries as well.
Oh, absolutely. Radio became this battleground for hearts and minds.
It's fascinating how this, what we might consider vintage technology, played such a huge role.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that in our digital age.
Yeah.
But back then, radio was cutting edge.
So how did different countries use radio for propaganda? I mean, were there any contrasting approaches?
Oh, definitely. You had the Nazis using it to spread their ideology, but then you had the Allies like the UK with the BBC World Service using it to counter that propaganda and broadcast news and information into occupied territories.
So it was like a war of words fought over the airwaves.
Exactly. And it wasn't just limited to Europe. The U.S. also got in on the action with Voice of America.
Broadcasting news and programs, promoting democratic values worldwide.
Right. They saw radio as a powerful tool for shaping global opinion.
It's amazing how even back then, there was this understanding of the power of international broadcasting.
Oh, yeah. It was a key part of the information war.
All this talk about radio made me think of the story of Tokyo Rose. Have you heard of her?
Oh, yeah. That's a wild one.
An American woman forced to broadcast Japanese propaganda to Allied troops during World War II.
A complex and tragic story. It really highlights how propaganda can exploit individual vulnerabilities, especially during wartime.
It makes you wonder, if you were in her shoes, would you have the courage to resist that kind of pressure?
It's a tough question to answer. It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're in that situation, who knows how you would react?
The power of propaganda, even through something as seemingly simple as radio, shouldn't be underestimated.
Absolutely. And that actually leads us to an interesting point. Radio, particularly shortwave radio, didn't disappear with the end of World War II. It became even more vital during the Cold War.
Now, that's something I didn't expect. So how did shortwave radio factor into the Cold War? Was it just more of the same propaganda?
It was more than just propaganda. It was a lifeline of information. The Soviet Union was notorious for its tight grip on information.
Oh, yeah. Heavily censoring anything that didn't align with their ideology.
Exactly. And that's where shortwave radio came in.
Yeah.
It had this incredible ability to travel vast distances.
So it could penetrate the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. Bringing news and alternative perspectives to people living under Soviet rule. The U.S. even funded Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty specifically for this purpose. dangerous.
Wow. So it was like a secret weapon against censorship.
You could say that. It allowed people behind the Iron Curtain to hear things their own governments wouldn't tell them.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, everything from human rights abuses to the realities of life outside the Soviet bloc. Things that challenge the official narrative.
I bet the Soviets weren't too happy about that.
They were not. They invested heavily in trying to jam those broadcasts.
Trying to block those signals from reaching their citizens.
It became a real technological arms race with each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
It's like a spy thriller playing out in the world of radio waves.
Right. It's incredible how this old technology played such a vital role in the fight for information freedom.
It really goes to show that the desire for information is powerful.
Yeah.
And people will find ways to access it, even in the face of censorship.
Absolutely. It's like a constant push and pull between those who want to control information and those who want to access it freely.
But hasn't that battle just shifted to the internet now?
Oh, you are absolutely right. We are in the information age. It's like we've traded one form of information control for another.
Yeah. Feels like we're constantly bombarded with information online. And it's hard to know what's real and what's not.
Exactly. And that brings us to the modern-day challenges of propaganda and censorship in the digital age.
Right, because governments like China, Russia, Iran, even the U.S. to some extent, they're all vying for control of the narrative online.
You got it. And they're using increasingly sophisticated tactics to do so.
It's like a whole new level of information warfare.
That's a great way to put it.
And we were just talking about how the battle for information control has shifted to the internet.
Right. It's the new frontier of propaganda and censorship.
And you mentioned that governments are using some pretty sophisticated tactics these days.
Oh, yeah. Things have gotten a lot more complex since the days of radio broadcasts and leaflets.
So what are we talking about here? What kind of tactics?
Well, think about it. We've got things like deepfakes, fabricated news sites, social media manipulation algorithms. It's a whole new toolbox for shaping narratives.
Deepfakes. Those are the videos where it looks like someone's saying or doing something they never actually did right.
Exactly. And they're getting incredibly realistic. It can be hard to tell the difference between a deepfake and a genuine video.
That's scary. I mean, if you can't even trust what you see with your own eyes, what can you trust?
It's definitely a challenge. And it highlights the importance of media literacy and critical thinking.
So how do we protect ourselves from these kinds of manipulations? I mean, how do we know what's real and what's fake?
Well, one key strategy is to diversify your news sources. Don't rely on just one outlet. Seek out information from various sources, both domestic and international.
So basically, don't get stuck in an echo chamber where you're only hearing what confirms your existing beliefs.
Exactly. By exposing yourself to different perspectives, you can start to see where the biases lie and get a clearer picture of what's really going on.
But even then, it still feels like we're bombarded with so much information. How do we sift through it all and find the truth?
It's definitely overwhelming. But here's the thing. The more you engage in this process of critical thinking and information evaluation, the easier it becomes.
It's like building a muscle.
Right.
The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some great tools and resources out there that can help. Fact-checking websites like PolitiFact and Snopes are really useful.
They can help you verify information and debunk false claims.
Right. They do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So you don't have to be an expert in every subject to spot misinformation.
That's good to know, because it can feel like you need a PhD in everything these days just to stay informed.
Yeah, I hear you. But honestly, the most important thing is to just be aware of the tactics being used.
So we can be more critical of the information we're consuming.
Exactly, because knowledge is power, but only if it's accurate and reliable knowledge.
Otherwise, it's just propaganda.
You got it.
It's almost like we have to be detectives these days when it comes to information.
I like that analogy, information detectives. We have to be skeptical, question our assumptions, and look for corroborating evidence.
So it's not just about finding different sources. It's about really evaluating those sources too.
Absolutely. You got to ask yourself, who's behind this information? What's their agenda? Are there any red flags?
Red flags like what?
Oh, emotionally charged language, logical fallacies, lack of credible sources, things like that.
It sounds exhausting, honestly.
It can be, but it's worth it. Think of it as an investment in your own knowledge.
And in our democracy, really.
Exactly, because if we can't tell the difference between truth and falsehood, then we're vulnerable to manipulation.
And to those who would exploit that vulnerability for their own gain.
Right, so it's about empowering ourselves to be informed citizens who can think critically and make sound judgments.
So where do we even start?
Well, first of all, don't be afraid to ask questions. And don't just take things at face value. especially online.
Right, because anyone can post anything on the internet these days.
Exactly. So you got to be discerning. Check sources, look for evidence, and be wary of anything that seems too good to be true.
Or too bad to be true, for that matter.
Good point. Because negativity bias can be just as powerful as positivity bias.
So how do we find reliable sources in the first place? I mean, there's so much out there.
Well, one good strategy is to start with reputable news organizations. Ones that have a track record of accuracy and fairness.
But even then, it's good to get multiple perspectives right.
Absolutely. Don't just stick to one news source. Read a variety of viewpoints, both domestic and international, left-leaning and right-leaning.
It's all about getting a balanced view of the information landscape.
Exactly, because no single source has a monopoly on the truth.
You know, it's interesting how we've come full circle in a way. From shortwave radio being this lifeline of information during the Cold War.
To the internet being the new battleground for information freedom today.
And in both cases, it's about finding ways to access and share information.
Yeah.
That challenges the official narrative.
Right, because the truth has a way of coming out, eventually.
Even if it's suppressed or distorted.
Exactly, it might take time. But the truth has a resilience that propaganda can't match.
That's a good thought to end on, I think. The truth will out.
The truth will out.
This has been another Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.